Just a little over 1 year after the release of Uncharted 4, Naughty Dog returns with a new, slimmer entry in the franchise. With a change in protagonist and new location, Uncharted: The Lost Legacy offers a taste of both the old and new. Uncharted 4 was a technical masterpiece at the time of release, but a lot can change in a year. Does The Lost Legacy hang with the likes of Horizon Zero Dawn and Gears of War 4, and what impact does the change in pacing have on the overall experience? Let's find out. Over the course of the last decade, Naughty Dog has become a master of the linear action game, but these productions can take some time. The release of Uncharted: The Lost Legacy then signifies a different kind of production in many ways. Starting life as a simple piece of DLC, The Lost Legacy has evolved into a full-blown standalone Uncharted adventure. But this faster production cycle also brings along a different approach to the series than we've seen in the past. The Lost Legacy is, in some ways, a prototype for what an open-world Uncharted game might be. That's right, once you break free from the action-packed introduction sequence, you're dropped into a vast Indian ruin on the hunt for treasure. Uncharted 4 previously included a similar section in which Drake and his friends drive around a jeep in Madagascar, but The Lost Legacy takes things a lot further by offering multiple objectives that can be visited in any order, alongside enemy installations and bonus quests. Between the infiltration of enemy strongholds and the mix of stealth and action, it feels like a microcosm of Metal Gear Solid 5 viewed through the lens of Uncharted. And it works. The new design appears to push Naughty Dog's technology further than before, with a map larger than anything we've experienced in previous games. Despite this, map density and complexity is on par with the most richly detailed areas in Uncharted 4. It's this sense of scale that provides the greatest sense of change then. Naughty Dog itself has confirmed that the game lacks any significant changes to the underlying renderer, but it manages to feel fresh because of its size. India is rich with dense foliage peppering the terrain, while intricate stonework acts as a framework for the game's temples. Without the globetrotting element, the adventure winds up feeling highly cohesive, a feeling not unlike that of the original Drake's Fortune. You'll go from beautiful scenes with crystal clear water that warps and reacts to each step, to muddy, rain-soaked parallax occlusion-mapped enabled terrain where realistic footprints are left behind as you move through it. Looking at the technology as a whole, it's clear that The Lost Legacy makes full use of techniques available, resulting in a more immersive overall experience. We examined many of these details back in our original look at Uncharted 4, but it's nice to see them return in full force. Physics remain key. Things like foliage react realistically as you move through it, while cloth flows naturally with character movement. Texture work remains highly refined, from the richly detailed mud and stone textures used across the ruins, to the depiction of skin and fabric. The quality is on par with Uncharted 4 itself, and like Uncharted 4, all of the game's major cutscenes are rendered entirely in real time. The urban locations are also rich in incidental detail, with hundreds of tiny trinkets placed around every scene. Even with its shorter development cycle, the eye for detail remains impressive. That's not to say it's 100% perfect though. These steps here were amusing, for instance, as it's possible to see right through the mesh itself, while the branches on this tree look a little out of place. And wait, this is extremely nitpicky, isn't it? Well, it's difficult to find fault in a production of this caliber, so when you do run across things like this, it does tend to stick out. Another aspect that helps bring everything together though is the lighting. From the moody city streets to the atmospheric ruins, Uncharted continues to offer realistic yet stylized lighting throughout. Bounce lighting is taken into account here as well, thanks to what appears to be a sort of pre-calculated global illumination technique, much like Uncharted 4. An early escape sequence also showcases the brilliant storm effects in play as players scamper across rooftops as claps of thunder and flashes of lightning strike alongside persistent gunfire. It's an incredibly impressive moment. The use of rain in general works very well here, along with some excellent shader work. The unique volumetric style lighting techniques that Naughty Dog introduced in previous games make a return as well, enabling some beautiful scenes as light shafts slice through the scene. When dealing with an APC at one point in the game, its headlight shines realistically across the misty environment and looks great. Altogether then, there's little doubt that The Lost Legacy is an incredible looking game. While the technology hasn't evolved much from the previous title, it's still quite the showcase. For the next generation of Naughty Dog tech though, we'll likely have to wait until The Last of Us Part 2. Which brings us now to platform comparisons. The Lost Legacy of course supports both the PS4 and the PS4 Pro. And on both consoles, image quality is generally superb thanks to world-class temporal anti-aliasing that all but eliminates shimmering and jagged edges. On the standard PS4 then, we're looking at a full 1080p, just like Uncharted 4. But on the Pro, things are a little less clear. Uncharted 4 is a 1440p game, and The Lost Legacy returns those results in most cases as well, but pixel counts occasionally turned up numbers that were either slightly above or below this value. It certainly seems unlikely that an adaptive resolution feature has been implemented for this game though, so it's likely that it's just the result of aggressive post-processing interfering with the pixel count. So for all intents and purposes then, we are looking at a 1440p game. Aside from the resolutions then, are there any other visible differences to consider? Well, after combing through loads of comparison scenes, the simple answer is, well, no. The presentation is identical across both consoles, save for the resolution. Of course, it's true that the increased resolution on the PS4 Pro does greatly improve image quality though when playing on a 4K TV. And even better, The Lost Legacy does support downsampling for owners of 1080p displays. This is kind of an interesting situation then. On one hand, it's great that users of all consoles will enjoy a similar experience, but on the other hand, the PS4 Pro implementation doesn't feel quite as robust as other games such as Horizon Zero Dawn. Without knowing where the bottlenecks lie though, it's difficult to say just how much further it could be pushed. I guess we'll find out with The Last of Us Part 2. Still, it's unlikely that anyone will have any complaints about the presentation here. It is a beautiful game. But how does it run? Well, that's an interesting question. Like Uncharted 4 before, The Lost Legacy is all about 30 frames per second in single player mode, and by and large, the performance is very, very stable. In fact, throughout most of the game, it's unlikely that you're going to encounter any dips at all. But that doesn't mean we didn't find some. This specific sequence, which focuses on rainy infiltration of an enemy stronghold, pushes the PS4 Pro just a little too hard, resulting in drops below 30 frames per second. As you can see, fluidity is mildly compromised in this scene. It's likely the mix of thick grass, which can eat GPU time, the rain effects, and the regular use of volumetric light cones emanating from the APC. Fortunately, slowdown of this magnitude is rather rare. In those instances when we did encounter additional slowdown though, it was typically limited to spots like this, filled with alpha textures and effects. This was the very first time we noticed any sort of performance stumbles at all, for instance. It's much the same on the standard PlayStation 4, which offers a very stable 30 frames per second throughout most of the game, with occasional pockets of slowdown in very select scenes. Even these busy effects-heavy sequences manage to run without any problems on the standard PlayStation 4. For a single-player focused game like Uncharted then, this is a solid level of performance that balances beautiful graphics with stable frame rate, and it works rather well whether you're using a PlayStation 4 or the PS4 Pro. But what about multiplayer? Well, unfortunately, we weren't able to jump into any competitive matches just yet due to its pre-release status and lack of players, but we did at least spend some time playing Survival, a mode that was added to Uncharted 4 late last year in December. As such, we haven't actually had a chance to analyze this in the past, but upon checking it out this time, the results were rather unexpected. You see, unlike the competitive mode, survival mode is limited to just 30 frames per second, like the campaign. Since it's an AI-focused wave-based mode, this really doesn't come as a great surprise here, but what is surprising is the resolution. On the standard PS4, survival is bumped up to 1080p, compared to the normal competitive mode's 900p resolution. On PS4 Pro, however, survival is also limited to just 1080p, rather than supporting the higher resolution as we see in single player. It is true that the multiplayer does seem to operate from a completely different EXE, but still, it's disappointing that this mode fails to take advantage of the PS4 Pro in any meaningful way. At least the competitive mode is bumped up to 1080p on the Pro versus the 900p as mentioned earlier, but again, we weren't able to test it this time around to see if there's any other improvements there. Thankfully, when looking at survival, performance is solid on both consoles, at least based on our basic tests. As always, it's a little difficult to say for sure when discussing multiplayer modes like this since gameplay can be so variable, but the first impressions and the various matches we played suggest that it does run well, just as before. It's entirely possible that if the scene gets busy enough, slowdown might occur on the regular PS4 that doesn't occur on the Pro, but unfortunately we weren't able to reproduce anything like that. So, what's the takeaway here then? Well, The Lost Legacy is an interesting experiment of sorts that offers the best ratio of development time to gameplay length that the studio has delivered to date. Sure, that's a rather strange metric to judge something by, but we're accustomed to waiting quite a long time for each new Naughty Dog project. The previous single-player add-on that they released for The Last of Us was also excellent, but it was a lot shorter and more limited than what we have here. At the same time, it's easy to understand how this was produced in such a short time frame since it lacks a lot of the more bombastic moments that we saw in Uncharted 4. Still, the change in pacing and flow are fascinating and do manage to work really well here. In some ways, the map design feels more akin to a game like Crysis than your typical open world, and that's a good thing. It's still relatively constrained, but there's plenty of freedom within when approaching each scenario. In other words, it's kind of an open world game within a linear framework. It'll also be interesting to see how this design influences The Last of Us Part 2. Open world design is popular these days, but some of us, such as myself, have grown somewhat tired of wide open maps filled with icons and NPCs, but mixing aspects of open world game design with a more linear scripted style of game can yield great results. It's easy to envision Naughty Dog's next game taking advantage of larger spaces while still retaining what makes these games so engaging. We're certainly interested to find out. But The Lost Legacy is here and now, and it's well worth playing. It's being sold for a reasonable price, there's plenty of content within, and the presentation remains every bit as impressive as you would expect. This is a top-tier stealth action game enhanced further by new mechanics such as the silenced pistol, which makes stealth more enjoyable than ever. So to loop back around to the original question, yes, Uncharted 4 and The Lost Legacy both stack up brilliantly against other high-end games like Horizon and Gears of War 4. There is no question in my mind that Naughty Dog is still at the top of its game, and since The Lost Legacy shares so much technology with Uncharted 4, this is still just their first attempt on the PlayStation 4. We're certainly excited for the future. But that's all for now though. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us on Twitter. And until next time, this is John, signing off.